some of the stuff that you're doing, which I think is just absolutely phenomenal. You are really, you as the district attorney, you've been the district attorney for 7 years now?
Yeah, I'm finishing my second term. I'll be 8 in December.
Okay, awesome. So you have done stuff. You have put action steps into some of the stuff we're talking about. So talk a little bit about, because I think what you're doing is incredible. And, I think, frankly, and I don't want this to sound the wrong way, but I think that some of the people in the cities on the coast and in Houston and, all over the place, they have this idea that a small town DA is not going to have these kind of ideas. So talk us through, as a small town DA, some of the stuff that you're doing in your community to make sure that all the different people that you serve feel like law enforcement is on their side.
Yeah. So I have to go back a couple of months. I have a really good friend of mine. His name is Calvin Ford. He's an African American here in Gatesville. Gatesville's a really small town, and the fact is, if you're African American in Gatesville, your last name is probably Ford, or you're a cousin. Yeah. And there's fantastic people, good family. And Calvin refs in a lot of sporting events, and my kids are very involved in athletics here in Gatesville, and we ran into each other at a basketball game, and he said, I really want to come talk to you about our relationships with law enforcement, and more importantly, how we can create a platform where we can start working and talking with kids and getting them to trust law enforcement and trust what y'all do, and at the same time we learn what y'all do. And so that's really kind of the genesis of when we started talking about that. And then of course, boom, we actually had a meeting planned with my office, with law enforcement, with school administrators, and with some folks in the community in March when COVID hit. Yeah. And we had to cancel that. Well, then George Floyd happened, and then the dominoes started to fall, and the national unrest really kicked into play. And that conversation with Calvin and I really started to morph and change into something a little different, as opposed to being focused on the younger generation and the younger folks here in the county. It really focused on law enforcement, our judicial system. Coryell County is not a very big county. Like I said, it's 75,000 people. Coppers Cove is my biggest community, about 35,000 people. Gatesville's, it's arguable anywhere from 7 to 10 because we have 5 prison units here, and they count the inmates when you drive by, and the city limit says 15,000. We're not 15,000. That's from PDCJ.
5,000 plus 10,000.
Yeah. So we really, I try to wrap my mind around how do I approach this where we can get connected. And that goes back to my discussion about getting connected with people so that we can start to trust each other. How do we start doing that? We got to be together and talk and address and navigate issues. So I thought about my days in Africa. And when I was in South Sudan, I was stationed in Juba, which is a really unique place in South Sudan. It's about 80 miles north of the Ugandan border, right on the White Nile River. And what we did with our international police force is we co-located with local law enforcement offices. We would send international police officers to actually hang out in the police stations all day to give them advice and suggestions and opinions on how to do their job as a civilian law enforcement officer. So I kind of decided to flip that idea. As opposed to law enforcement going to co-locate within the community, have the community co-locate within my office.
Nice.
And so we created this idea called MAPS, which is the Minority Advisory Panel Support. And
when did you start this, by the way?
What's that?
When did you start the MAPS program?
We started the discussions of it in April and May, and we had our first meeting in June.
Yeah.
Our first meeting comprised of folks from the African American community in Coryell County, both in Gatesville and in Coppers Cove. And in the first meeting, I didn't allow any law enforcement officers in there. I wanted them to be able to speak freely without worried about what this cop thinks of them. And mind you, all 3 of my top law enforcement officials in the county, Eddie Wilson, who's the chief of police in Coppers Cove, Scott Williams, the sheriff here in Coryell County, and Nathan Gohlke, my chief of police in Gatesville, are all 100% behind this. And I'll tell you why in a minute. But I didn't allow any of them in that first meeting. I don't think it really rubbed them wrong, but they were like, hey, why weren't we in there? Because my point is, we need to hear from them. This is like being at confession. They don't need the person that they feel like sinned against them there.
Yeah.
But we didn't have any of those kind of discussions in that first meeting. It was really more about the African American experience, period.
Yeah.
Not about specific law enforcement issues in the county. And so that was the first big group we had. Then we had a second meeting where it got a little bigger, and it was the makeup was a little bit more dynamic. We had both African American community, and we actually invited the law enforcement in and other community members to come in and discuss this. And from that, from the bigger meetings, we designed the panel, which are made up of 5 individuals from Coryell County communities, 3 of which must be minority. They have to be of a minority demographic in Coryell County, whether that's African American, Hispanic. We also have a lot of Koreans here down in Copper Scope because of cancer. So 3 must be minority, and the other 2 can just be at large. And what they do is those 5 individuals on that panel will come into my office, and for anybody that's ever experienced grand jury, it's a little bit like that. We actually present at the stage we're at right now, we're presenting cases that the suspect or the defendant is of minority.
Yeah.
And our demographics lend to that's not a big case load, nothing like what Chemog deals with in Harris County. So I think our first meeting, we had 13 or 14 suspects like that. Those 5 people come in and they evaluate those cases in 3 different ways. What was the law enforcement interaction like? Was it fair? Was it professional? Were they treated right? Was there any use of force that was unnecessary? So first, it's a law enforcement study, right? The second evaluation is how my office screens those cases. How did we receive that report, evidence, and facts, and what is our thought process and how we evaluate and what we're going to do to that case? Are we going to dismiss it? Are we going to present it to grand jury? Are we going to offer a plea? Are we going to possibly go to trial? But we're looking at all those things in that second prong. And that's really where they help us, and they help my 4 prosecutors that work for me, because I really want their input. How does this suspect or this individual of minority, how do they get to making this kind of bad decision?
Yeah.
And then in our thought process, and it's pretty, I have a pretty strict process here on how we screen cases. And if you're 18 to 24 years old with no criminal history, how can we help you? Yeah. Now, unless you've committed a very violent crime that puts you in rare air, and we triage that differently. If it's a low-level felony, how can we help you? What tools and equipment can we provide you to make you a better citizen? Because if we send you to TDC at 18 to 24, you're smoked. You're done.
You're done. And not to interject here, but I've heard people say, "Well, George Floyd was a criminal," right?
Yeah.
And so I look back and say, I look back at his criminal history, and because I was curious, what it was, and it turns out that his first offense was a low-level drug offense. He got a bad court-appointed lawyer, ended up with a felony, which set him on a very bad path. Can't get a job, can't vote, and so, and the sad thing about that is, Dusty, he was guilty of doing something that you and I personally know people have done the same exact thing. He was just unlucky. And so, that's people.
But even people, and to that point, even with people with felony criminal histories that come to our office, you don't design a sentence about what people's past is about. I think it's a percentage of the calculation. It's a percentage of the equation you have to look at, but that shouldn't dictate your outcome.
Yeah.
But I tell people all the time is cases, we are like doctors. Every patient is different. And just because you have a cold or the flu doesn't mean the doctor is going to prescribe the exact same thing they did the person before. Your DNA is different.
Yeah.
Every defendant is different. And especially a minority, if we're considering their social economic issues, their education issues, where they were raised, who they were raised by, all these things went into their wiring. And so that's where
a lot of that stuff is just, if you trace it back far enough, it's just pure luck. I was born, I was unlucky in that I was, my mother died when I was young. We all have those kind of experiences, but I had a great father who gave me great life lessons. And I feel very, very fortunate and lucky about that, because I had nothing to do with who my father or my mother was. And so,
Yes.
so keeping that, keeping that in mind, and I love what you said about every defendant is different. We
right.
have to treat people as individuals. That's where we need to get to.
Once you start treating people like cookie cutters,
yeah,
those people are going to the minorities are naturally, by their circumstances, going to get cut the same way than other people have in their American experience. Let's just get real about that, from where they come from. Right. You have to recognize that.
Yeah.
So that's really the second prong with that is them getting to look behind the curtain on how we come up, how we decide to move forward on a case or not.
Yeah.
And that's where their input and opinion is really important to my prosecutors, because they're really getting to see some opinions and some things that a potential jury may ask.
Yeah.
In Houston and some of the bigger cities, you can hire shadow juries and you can try your case before. This is not unsimilar to that, where they get to see the facts and the evidence. Now, one thing, they don't know the name of the defendant. We don't tell them who it is.
Okay.
We just tell them the facts and the evidence in the scenario, and then they give us some feedback. So after they've seen how the law enforcement performance was, they get to evaluate how we screened it and give us opinions on how to better understand it on this suspect or defendant. And then the third prong is the outcome. We tell them what we're likely to recommend to the judge or to a jury, or what our plea offer to the defense attorney would be, and what are their opinions about that.
Yeah.
Because quite frankly, most of our offers when we're negotiating with defense attorneys is based on our jury verdicts, because that's what the community has told me they expect outcomes with criminal cases.
Yeah.
So if I have a drug dealer, and my jury says, I want you in prison for 20 years, and you have and the equation suggests that you're in that same category, then my offer is probably going to be anywhere from 16 to 18 years, because that's consistent with my jury's values. But again, that goes back to how we triage the cases. What is the age? What was their upbringing like? What are the conditions that we're going to send them back into? Is it conducive to overcoming this or not? Or what can we do to change that? All those things are variables that you have to study, that